Hey everybody, my name is Daryl Obert, and today I have the pleasure of having Mr. Michael Todd with us, and we're going to be talking about XGen. So it's going to be broken down into 3 different videos. There's going to be, the first video is going to be long hair, then we're going to do a video for short hair, and the last one we'll finish up will be kind of archive instancing workflows. So we're going to look at this file, and what I wanted to do with this is, this was a model that came off of Turbo Squid, and I really liked the polygon geometry here, how it sort of looked like ribbon, so I wanted to capture that, but still make it look a little bit more soft or natural. So I figured XGen would be a great way to do that. And in opposed to doing a groom tube that we've done before, tube grooming, which we've talked about in other videos on Maya Mondays, I still really wanted to capture the look and feel of this sort of ribbon effect. So all I did was I extracted curves from the polygon edges from this, and I'm going to use those to ultimately become the guides that drive my XGen description. So I've got these curves that we've already gone through and sort of essentially, or basically extracted out of that polygon mesh, and we're going to use those to generate the guide curves that are going to drive the instance primitive. So let's go ahead and select our scalp, and we're going to add a new XGen description to that. And when we bring up the XGen window and we add this description on here, we're going to tell it that we want to basically use guides to do the overall shaping as opposed to using expressions or attributes. So we'll go ahead and we'll do splines and we'll hit create. So as soon as we do that, we're represented with these little X's on the surface here. So what's going on here, Michael?
That is the XGen patch, which actually uses the geometry that you selected to build a reference in world space for where XGen is going to be grown, on what faces it's going to be grown on, and it also calculates the surface area of the faces. So that goes towards the density. So because density is primitives per unit area, which is calculated in centimeters. So then if you give it a density of 100, it will generate 100 primitives per centimeter squared. So that's how, and also the width is affected by the size as well. Because the width is out in real space, world space as well. So 0.05 is 0.05 centimeters.
So size matters.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we've gone ahead and we've done that. Now, obviously, we said we wanted to use guides to help us control those primitives. We don't have any guides on our hair yet. So what we're going to do is go ahead and just add all these curves in. And I can just grab that hierarchy, jump over to the utilities. And in the utilities, we have convert curves to guides. And there's been some changes to this, or a new option added in 2016, the ability to preserve dynamic links. So why is that there? What situations would you want to use something like preserve dynamic links?
We added that because quite a few people were asking for the ability to actually have one set of guides control several descriptions, but we can't do that right now, but that's one of the things we want to add. But this is a workaround for that, so you can actually have one set of curves driving multiple guides in multiple descriptions, so you can adjust the shape of the curves, and that will drive the shape of the guides in several descriptions at once, rather than having to do one set and then try and copy and paste them and match them from description to description. This makes it easy to use one set of curves to drive guides in several descriptions.
Right, and because that they're dynamically linked, that means if we put a hair system on that set of curves, it's driving those guides, they'd ultimately get the physics
that is
from
also it's an alternate way to actually drive the animation if you want to do that. So if you have a hair system, you could use the output curves to drive the animation of the primitives.
Awesome. So we're not going to do that for this example because this is a little more basic. We're just going to have one set of one description in our scene. So we'll just go ahead and delete the curves. We'll add the guides in there. So as soon as we do that, you can see that we now have a color representation saying that they're no longer curves. They're now guides. So if we hit our preview, we get some hair, but it's not looking so sweet, right? Like it's a mess, right?
The defaults, we set the defaults low so that the performance wouldn't be impacted. So we didn't want to have too many CVs and too much density right off the bat, because you might want to just see that you're getting a result, but it might not be the result you actually want.
Right. So for these instanced primitives to capture the overall look and feel of those guides, they're going to need a higher CV count. So we'll just kind of crank that up. I've just put up to something like 50, which should be a good balance between performance and capturing.
It enables the primitives to closely match the guide shapes and the interpolation.
Okay.
And the density is actually very nice.
Yeah, we'll crank that density up too. So as we start to go through this here, obviously we need to start to further refine this. So it's a little thick. We'll go ahead and we'll start to drop down that width, maybe to something like 0.05. And we also have, this was newly added, this width ramp. So why do we have that? What's the advantage of using the width ramp over the old taper, things that we had?
Yeah, the primary purpose for the width ramp was to be able to add custom shaping to the primitives down the length, so you could actually have, you could use it for, this in hair, it's probably just going to taper off towards the tip, But in something like grass blades, you can actually change the shape of the width down the length, so you can actually create a blade of grass shape or a leaf shape if you're using it for like leaves on a tree or something like that. But also, having the taper, you can still control the taper by an expression, so you can still randomize that with an expression. But this actually, the tapering is to mimic the effect of the hair becoming more transparent towards the tip without the the cost of transparency in the renders, because transparency in renders it'll slow the render down a lot.
Right. And another thing that's worth mentioning is the ability to turn on and off tube shade both independently in the preview for the primitives as well at the shader level. So why would you want to have tube shade on? Why would you want to have tube shade off?
If you were going to get very close, then you might want to see because hair is cylindrical, so it has a tube shape, and this actually mimics the tube shading that you would get, and then it can increase the anisotropic highlighting of the hair in the renders. But in the preview, that can get quite noisy because the anti-aliasing doesn't really cover the artifacting you're going to get on the display. So you can turn it off in the preview, but you can keep it on in the render if you want. But
right.
Usually people tend to turn it off.
So you can see as I kind of shift this around here, we've kind of got the little moire pattern happening and things like that. So if we turn tube shade off, it just cleans up the display and it looks pretty good. And I am running 16x samples on this, so I've got the sampling kind of cranked up pretty high. But by turning that tube shade off, the hair really starts to look pretty sweet in Viewport 2.0. Thank you for that.
That's right.
All right, so the next thing that we want to talk about is if we look at the top of this head, we've got some issues happening here, especially around this part. So how do we go about addressing that, and what's going on here? Why does this look the way it does?
Well, the guides control the shape and the interpolation. Each guide interpolates to its nearest neighbor, and it builds up a connectivity map underneath that. So this guide will interpolate to that guide and its nearest neighbors. But because there's guides on the other side of the head, it's interpolating across, and it'll go through the head actually. So if you go inside the head, you can see that the primitives are actually crashing through the head, and you really don't want that, because then hairs could pop in and out of the surface of the mesh when it's animated. So to control that, you'd add a region map.
Okay, cool. So let's walk through that. So the first step in adding the region map is setting
to turn the region map effect on, you set the region mask to 1, and then it will complain about it doesn't have a region map yet, so you have to paint the region map.
All right, so let's jump in here and grab our paint tool.
And by default, it floods it to one uniform color, and then you select a different color, and each color represents a different region. So every guide that falls within a certain region will interpolate with guides in that region, but if they're outside of that region, it won't interpolate to them.
It's also worth mentioning that you want to set your brush, if it's not set to have the non-interpolation profile.
Yeah, you don't want any blending, because each color has to be unique, and it can't blend between them, because that could introduce artifacting in the interpolation.
Yeah, so just make sure you hit the third icon in on the paintbrush tool.
By default, it should be on. But
should be.
And you can control the region map effect with a mask as well, so you can paint a mask so that the hair doesn't interpolate where you want it in the part, but when towards the back you want the hairs to start interpolating again, you can fade off the region map effect.
So I'm going to go ahead and just paint a little bit of a bang region up here. Something like that. And then, so this map effect, oops, looks like I painted through on the backside. Yeah. That's not cool.
Oh, the projection painting.
Yeah, should have turned that off. Let's go ahead and just sample that color and clean that guy up a little bit there, and sample this red. Probably used primary colors when I painted this anyway, but if I didn't.
No, they should be in the custom color palette as well. So.
All right, so we've got that set up pretty good. So how do we go about adding this?
And then you need to save the map.
Yep. So when we hit the save button, what's going on there?
Well, you're painting a texture map within Maya, but then this is getting baked out to a ptext map that XGen will read. And then you should see that the interpolation is now not happening across the region boundary. Yep,
so it looks a lot better than it did before, for sure. And you said that we could go back here and start to fix this so that it kind of transitions off. So it has a part at the top of the head and then it kind of fades off.
So where you see the region mask, you go create a map.
So go in there, hit create map. So what's map resolution? We see this, and every time we bring up the paint tool, what is that actually doing?
That is texels per unit area, which again is centimeters. So for higher definition or resolution in the map, you want to put that number up. 5 is a default. It's probably too low by default, so we may change that. But 20 would be a good map resolution. And also, if your object is really, really big and you have a very high texel resolution, your PTX file is going to be very large. So that's something to be aware of.
So now I just want to basically just paint kind of black.
You want black towards the back and white towards the front. So there's, yeah, that's an artisan.
Yes, that's a nice one.
So you want to go over that with the
solid brush.
The solid brush, and you might, a bit higher up as well towards the back of the part.
Up here?
Yeah.
Okay.
A bit higher up where the.
Right there.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
A bit further up, actually.
Further.
There.
That's where you want it.
Yeah.
All right, you're like an art director. This is a lot of fun. All right, let's save that map out. And if we go back and preview these, it looks a lot better.
Interpolating across the back. And you got some crashing in there, so you might want to fix that.
All right, so how do we go about fixing this crashing?
You could use you select the guides, hide the preview so you can select the guides that are causing the problem. And you select that row of guides underneath there.
So maybe grab this curve here, this curve, this curve, this curve. So I'm adding to my selection, just holding down my shift key to kind of grab
and
these
then go
underlying
to the utilities.
surfaces. Okay, once we're in there.
And guides to surface.
Guides to surface, okay.
And then you can use, convert that to a NURB surface, and you can use the, okay.
So what has happened there? It gave me a NURB surface, obviously.
Well, it converts the guides back to curves and then does a loft on the selected guides, on the selected curves. And obviously, because the guides were derived from the geometry earlier, that each guide has got different CV counts.
Okay.
So you might want to normalize the CV counts on the guides, so you'd have to rebuild them.
Okay, so to walk through the process of doing that, let's convert the surface back to guides, right? Let's grab all of our guides, which has a higher selection priority, so you can just bounding box swipe over that.
Sorry, go to the primitive tab.
Okay.
And then there's a rebuild guide tool. Oh, you lost the selection.
I lost my selection there. All right.
And then go rebuild.
So in that,
And you might want to give it
like 30 or 40?
30, 32, 36, something like that. 40 would be fine.
I like 40. All right, so now we've rebuilt those. So now we can go back and grab this series of curves here. And you can make selection sets of these guides too, right? Or you can group them. Like if you know that you're going to be working with these a lot, going back and forth between the two, you could just go ahead and just kind of group those guys. So I just did a Control G. So now if I grab one, hit the up arrow key, it just gives me that quick selection.
So when you go back to the utility, you can actually convert those back to a surface and then sculpt them, so you can push them back.
Okay, so to sculpt that, what am I going to use to sculpt that?
What's the name of it? The sculpt tool, sculpt geometry tool.
So go into modeling, surface, sculpt geometry tool. So this is different than the kind of mudbox-based sculpting tools. Those only work on poly. So we have to use the legacy.
This is the original, the old school sculpting tool.
Okay, so we'll bring that guy up, and I can just grab my brush here.
Relax or smooth on those.
Or just kind of push those in a little bit because they were sort of riding over that surface. So we'll just sort of cave in that surface. So this is a much faster way than trying to manually move all those CVs, right, on all those curves.
Yeah, you could also use the guide sculpt tool as well. That was added to 2016.
Kind of using my smooth tool to kind of smooth that out, holding down the shift key there.
The relax tool is a good one as well, because then it doesn't, the base CVs won't get affected by because smooth can actually affect the overall shape of the.
Okay. So now if we convert back to guides, you can see those guides now take into effect all of those changes that we've made. That's kind of wavy, but still kind of fun. So let's go ahead and just hit a preview on that and see what happens. So now you can see that back is no longer kind of crushing through or passing through there. So we really did kind of get those different layers of hair stacked up in a more realistic, natural looking way. All right, so what are we going to do to make this look a little bit better? What's the next thing? So I've got my part kind of looking cool now. I've fixed some problems on the back by converting those curves into that surface, kind of did some sculpting work on it. What's the next thing to take this hair?
You probably want to add some clumping, because hair shafts have got scales on them in real world, and that they interlock, so they actually stick together.
Okay.
So the clumping model emulates that.
All right.
So that would be under the modifiers tab.
Just get our shadows turned back on there and add in a modifier. So we're going to add a clumping modifier, right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's bring up this first one here. So we have a clumping modifier in here. I added on, and
It won't have any effect by default.
no effect. So what's going on with this? What do we need
You
to
have
do?
to add control maps for that, and because you've got a region map, you need to use control maps to make sure that the clumping regions, because it's similar to region mapping in that it's procedurally defining regions within which the clumps are going to be taking effect. So you set up the maps, and you could use the guides as the base point for the first clumping modifier.
Okay, so we'll go say set up maps.
So for this one, you could use hit guides, and then it will create a clump point per guide.
Okay, so we do that.
And it's got the use control maps on. It's using the region map, so
Everything should be set up there just fine.
that should be fine. Yep.
And just hit save, right? So as soon as we hit save on that guy, it's going to go through.
And you haven't got the auto preview, so.
What's that?
So if you hit preview now, you should see.
Oh yeah, auto preview is not turned on.
So now you're seeing that it's very clumpy, because by default it actually goes from the root to the tip, and then the tip is completely clumped.
Okay, which is kind of cool, but I really don't want my bangs having quite that intensity, right? So, can I add multiple clumps on here? Can I paint maps for each clump? How would I?
You can have, because they've got the mask effect, you could paint a map on that, or you can paint a clump magnitude map as well, or instead of.
Okay.
So you could add a mask to either the masking or the clumping magnitude effect.
Okay, so let's just mask out the bangs so that they don't get clumped there.
So do create map on the mask.
All right, so we'll create a map on that guy. It's got my resolution set to something pretty high, like 30. That's cool. So if we turn off our preview on that.
And then so where you want it to be reduced, you paint on that surface. So,
All right, so we'll go back to the paint tool. Make sure that our mask is kind of set here. Something like that. Actually, yeah, let's undo that. Let's make that brush a little smaller. It's a little, I just want just that area not to get clumped. So that looks good. So we hit the save button on that.
Yep. That bakes out another PTEX texture.
So now if we preview that.
It should be less. So yeah, where are the guides?
These
the
guys
are originally further back.
Okay, okay. So we'll go back into that paint tool. Hide that preview one more time. These are also bangs. Look at that. I've got bangs everywhere. So we'll just do something like that, and I think that should probably take care of everything for us there. Yeah, that looks much better.
Did you preview?
Yeah, auto preview's on.
Yep, so they're less clumped. And you can have multiple levels of clumping, so you could have clumps within clumps. And if you add a second clump modifier, the density of the clump points needs to be higher than the primary clumping modifier, so the clumps happen within the clump regions. Okay.
So let's talk about clumps in clumps. Like and there's lots of stuff in here, like copy effect, cut effect. Why so much control in the clumping modifier? What's
because the
going on here?
It's the order operation type of thing. It's when you got the primitives, you set the density. That's how many primitives per unit area, and then you've got the parameters like length and depth and width, and all those are calculated kind of in that order, and then the guides shape those primitives. But then clumping has to come first in the order of operations for the modifiers. So that would mean that if you wanted to add a noise modifier, you couldn't add the noise modifier before the clump modifier. So that's why there's a bunch of controls in the clump modifiers themselves that enable you to noise the clumps.
Okay.
But they work on a per clump level rather than a per primitive level, so then you could add a noise modifier that would act after the clump on a per primitive level.
Okay, so on the noise, what parameters should I pump in here? Like just
you could put if you put just an integer in there, it'll just give you a value, but then there won't be an effect because the magnitude slider is not up, so if you put that up.
So start to pull this up, it starts to introduce in that noise.
Yeah, so if you increase that.
Give it a high value, you can really see.
So you can see that, and then there's a noise frequency, which is how many times down the length the noise is going to take effect. So the higher the frequency, the more effect you're going to get.
Okay.
But you can see that it's actually noising each clump rather than each primitive.
Right, which is exactly what we were trying to illustrate here.
So if you drop it from to the root to 0, you'll only affect the tips.
Okay.
And you can randomize that with an expression as well.
Of course. Cool. Well, that looks pretty good. I actually like the noise on there. Let's kind of put that back down to something like 4. So if I wanted to add another, set of clumping, how many clumping, like clumps and then subclumps, like What's
You
the idea there?
Because hair, you have major clumps, and then within that you'll have sub-clumping, and that happens a lot in real hair. So you get clumps within clumps, and you can iterate those quite a lot. But once you get below 3 or 4, depending on the size of the groom, in real world scale, you might not get much effect if you go past 3 clumps.
Okay. So for this one, we're going to add a second clump to give some sub-clumps on top of these guys. So we'll add in another clumping. As soon as we do that,
It will complain because they said there's no maps.
right. So we have to go set up our maps. So on this one, we don't want to use the guides. We want to have something a little denser than the
So
guides.
you might want to hide the preview on this,
Okay.
and then set up the density to be higher, like 10 or something maybe.
Okay.
And then if you do generate, you'll see the clump points generated on the surface, and that'll give you an idea of how many clumps you're going to get.
So that density is 10 clumps per centimeter,
Yeah.
basically, the way it's set. So I like that. That looks pretty good. So we just
And it's using the control map C, so it's actually, because you've got a region map on the first clump, that uses the control map, but then it uses the first clumping maps as control maps, because this clump regions have to fit within the previous clump regions, because if they don't, the primitives can just start to do weird stuff.
Okay, so if you've done a region map, the key here is, the takeaway is, use control maps should be on.
In the first clump, yes, and if you've got secondary clumping, the control maps should be on. You can leave it off, but you might get weird effects.
Okay,
You might get
so
uncontrollable effects.
Safer just to leave it on.
Yeah.
We'll go with the safe bet there. So we'll kind of do that. And you can see now that we now have, obviously, these sub-clumps, and you can see the effect just by turning that on.
Oh, because you've got the preview within the camera only.
Oh, yeah, okay. Let's turn that off. So preview within camera,
It's
talk
on
about
the
that.
preview output. So if you've got a very large field of grass or something, you don't want to generate primitives, waste time generating primitives that the camera can't see. So if you have that on, it will only generate primitives that are in the camera frustum.
So my head was getting chopped out of the frustum, so that's why it didn't generate the
So
primitives.
when you went when the top of the scalp was out of view, it wouldn't generate the primitives.
All right, so let's jump back to these modifiers. So that's the base clumping, right? And then if we put on the sub-clumps, you can see that we get these nice little kind of packets of strands sort of kind of grouped together, going down those guide-based clumps. So it starts to look, more and more realistic as we start to build this groom up a bit more. Yep. So the next thing that we want to talk about is adding in maybe some noise based on at the primitive level, so not in the clumping level.
So you would add a noise modifier for that.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in here and add in this noise modifier. Noise. You've used this tool before, I can tell.
Once or twice.
Yeah. All right, so we've got this noise modifier added in here, and just so we can see what's going on with this guy, I'm gonna crank that magnitude up, pretty high.
And you can go revert to a slider, so you can actually slide it along. So if you go reset to slider,
Okay.
and then you can actually move that around.
And it's worth mentioning that everything in XGen's expressions, right? So if we look at this, that's basically building that $A slider for me, right? Yeah. Which is pretty cool.
And with that, where in the red regions you're setting the min max, so you might want to you could expand that the range of operations, stuff like that. So you could put 10 or minus 10 to 10.
Yeah. So we'll just say accept.
Well, that one it works like 0 to 1 or 0 to 10. So
yeah. So now if I start to crank that out, obviously we get
more effect.
More effect happening. So
again, we've just got a spline control to affect it from root to tip. So if you drop it towards the root, it'll have less effect, and more effect towards the tip, and then it's getting really frizzy.
So I noticed, it's interesting because if you look at the noise on the longer hairs, it looks different than the noise on the bangs. And what's going on with that?
Well, each primitive has got the same number of CVs. So the longer hairs have got fewer CVs per centimeter. Okay. So the noise effect is having more effect on the shorter hairs effectively than the longer hairs, and because the range works from root to tip, and these hairs are shorter, you're seeing less of the effect on that. It's less obvious that the effect is lower towards the root.
Okay.
But you can control that effect based on the length, so you can actually in the magnitude.
Let's go into the expressions for this guy, and let's change that. So we want to have it based on the length. So how do you want to write an expression that does something like that?
You could multiply this by the final calculated length, which is $C length. So what that does is then it multiplies the effect based on the length of the primitives. So it looks at how long the primitives are and says, oh, use this effect more on the longer primitives than the shorter primitives.
Okay, so C length is something that's really quite useful.
See, and that made it. So if we drop the magnitude down a lot.
Because now we're multiplying it times the length of the hair, which is, they're long, right? So let's get that guy dropped down to a lower value.
So now the longer hairs should have more, and they are actually, there's more effect on the longer hairs than on the shorter hairs.
Which is exactly what we kind of wanted to have there.
And there's almost none on the bangs, and there's still some on the longer hairs.
Very cool, very cool.
And you can do the same thing for the frequency as well.
Great. So the last thing that we want to talk about to finish this up is I want to get some mutant hairs in there, or some stray hairs in there.
Hairs, yeah.
So this is pretty straightforward to do, and I've talked about this in other Maya Mondays posts in the past, but it's always good to just kind of go over again one more time. So if you go to your description, you can set a stray percentage, and this is going to set the number of hairs that you can then reference in an expression, right? So if we put that to something like 10, 10% of the hairs now could be called out as strays. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another noise to add in something that's going to grab and pull those strays out a little bit more. So we'll layer a second noise on top of this guy, and if we put the magnitude on this guy up to like 10, maybe we change that frequency down to something a little bit, make it a little bit higher, so they're like slightly larger frequency there. We only want a few of these hairs to get pulled out by this guy. So how do I go about doing that?
In the mask, you want to do add the stray expression to the mask effect. So it will calculate which hairs to add the effect to based on the stray expression you set earlier.
Right. Now, I always like to save my expressions out. I use strays all the time. So I've got a stray 10 to 0.2 saved out right now. Okay. So if we go ahead and we add that in there, you can see that basically what this is doing is it's essentially going through and it's saying, give me the strays. It's holding that in those brackets. Mm-hmm. And it's essentially setting a value of either 10 or 0.2 based on that. Now we can go just do 10 to 0 on this, right?
So what that is, it says a comparative expression. So it is looking at the effect and saying, if a primitive has been generated as a stray, apply the 10, and if it is not, apply the 0 or the 0.2.
Okay, great. So if we put that frequency low, you can see that now we've got sort of this very low frequency happening, kind of pulling some of those hairs out. We can overdrive this magnitude. We'll just really crank it up so you can really see those strays getting
So that's 10% of the hairs getting really blown away.
Yeah, that's crazy. I don't like that. Let's go back down to 10.
A bit of frizz on that one.
All right. Well, that's pretty much it as far as long hair goes. I think we covered off quite a few different examples of how to start to tap into the power of XGen. It's really, really deep. I mean, that's the key takeaway for me is, every time I'm working in XGen, I don't know how to do something, I call you, I'm saying, how do I do this? And you always have an answer. So, you can tell this tool's been around.
So this is not going completely in depth. This is a basic overview, but they can do a lot more with it than what we're showing here. But this is giving you the basics, the idea of how you can use expressions to control things based on parameters that you give it, such as length or width. So you could have the effect be more on the longer hairs than the shorter hairs, or the wider hairs or the thinner hairs. So all those things are achievable via expressions, which it would have been really difficult to put everything in a UI for that kind of things. But with the SE expressions, you could actually use it to build those controls into the UI. So you can actually get that control and flexibility that would be very difficult to have built into the UI from the start.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth, like we've mentioned in other videos, and I think in this one also, all the UI, it's basically being dynamically built from the expression language. So it's very, very simple to start adding in your own sliders, or your own widgets, or taking those things and multiplying them times maps or things like that. So it's super, super flexible, and we'll see a bit more of that in the following 2 videos that we're going to be putting together later today. Okay. Thanks everybody for taking the time to check it out.